Hey guys, how's it going? Some of you guys know this, but I am taking a class right now in adult Bible study teaching method. And one of the requirements for this class is that they tape me teaching on a passage that they give me, either to a Sunday school class or a small group or some small venue of people. And then that way that they can watch me teaching and then that they can return that then they can kind of review that teaching series and they can give me some feedback. And so this week for our small group, we're going to take a break from our normal teaching through Joseph. And we're going to actually just spend some time talking about this passage just to fulfill that requirement for me. And I think it'll be a blessing. The passage that we're going to talk about is Jeremiah 31 through 40. And that passage is about how God promises to make the new covenant. But before you can understand the new covenant, you need to understand the old covenant. And so I wanted to make this video describing the old covenant and describing what the importance of the old covenant was. And that way we'll all be on the same page when we get started for the small group. And the old covenant is primarily referring to the Mosaic covenant. That is the covenant that God established with Moses on Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments. We read about the establishment of this commandment in Exodus 20 and 21, 19 and 20, I'm sorry. Really, I'd just like to read a few verses just so you kind of get the flavor of God giving this covenant. He says this, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." And so I just wanted to make this video talking about just a couple of facets of this covenant that God is giving them, just so you'll be able to understand it when we start talking about the new covenant. The first thing that's important to understand about the covenant is that Yahweh presents himself as the covenant-keeping God. Yahweh, the Lord, shows himself, reveals himself to be the covenant-keeping God. He doesn't wait for someone to find it out. He presents himself this way. The second thing is that Yahweh is the one who sets the conditions. In this kind of treaty, what's called a suzerain vassal treaty, there'd be a superior and an inferior. And in this situation, the Lord, Yahweh, is the superior. And so he's the one who gets to set the conditions. The third thing that you see in as far as the covenant keeping goes is that God gave assurances. Yahweh gave assurances. There were certain promises that the Lord made. He said, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. And what's really key to understand about this is that Israel agreed to keep this covenant. Israel agreed to keep this covenant. They said, hey, we will keep this, we will obey the covenant. That's why they say in verse 8, just a little bit later, all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. The people agreed to the terms of this covenant. And we see that God puts Moses to speak to Israel for God and to speak to God for Israel. Moses is what's called the covenant mediator. He stands in the gap. And another element that we see about this covenant is that Israel had to consecrate themselves, set themselves apart to be a holy people for God. And yet God was still so holy that they couldn't draw near to him. And so there's this kind of Godward direction about this covenant. Now, all of those things came from an article. All those 6 things came from an article by a guy named Van Groningen on the covenant, which is in the Baker Evangelical Dictionary of Biblical Theology. I'm going to have that link in the notes for this video. But one thing that I would add to Groningen's list that he does not add is that God makes this covenant with Israel. He doesn't make it with Edom or with Moab or with Canaan or with Egypt. He makes this covenant with Israel. It's very important for this passage. And I would just say this is the context for the covenant, but there's a problem. Maybe you noticed it. You see, we said Israel agreed to the laws and the stipulations. They agreed to the terms, but Israel could not keep it. There was no way that Israel could have lived up to this covenant. And yet, maybe out of presumption, maybe out of pride, maybe out of ignorance, they said, we will do it. And therefore, the covenant that was established could never bring Israel close to God, and they needed a new covenant because they were totally unable to keep the old one. And that's what leads us into Jeremiah 31.